Warning, the podcast you're about to listen to may contain graphic descriptions of violent acts and injury. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to the Murder Police Podcast.
Okay, Wendy, we have finished episode 1 of the murder of Michael Turpin in Lexington, Kentucky, and now we're about to introduce the listeners to episode 2. Thinking back on episode 1, were there things that stood out for you that got your attention?
Absolutely. It details the power of observation and experience and intuition that a good detective uses. And Fran Root was no exception in this. His intuition was just on point the whole time.
Exactly. And what was interesting when you talk about what a good detective does is that even though he felt strongly about where this might go and probably would go, he was clear to point out, too, that he didn't close his mind to other things in this case that were possibilities, which is critical. And I thought that was interesting to hear, and I think the listeners probably caught that, too.
You're right. Fran absolutely was intuitive on this. And it's crazy because it's one of those things that seemed like everyone, including Michael's parents and friends, could feel something was wrong, and Fran was no exception to that as well.
It just looked like Michael was probably blinded by love, just so enthralled with her.
He was. I think she was his first real girlfriend, and Elizabeth certainly captivated him, and against his mother's wishes, he just kept trying and trying to make things work with Elizabeth, and, ultimately, as we heard prior, he married her. Now, when episode 1 ended, Fran was interrupted while conducting an interview at the police headquarters, and he was told that a body had just been located at a golf course in Lexington.
So it looks like it's going to move from a missing person case to a homicide.
Well, it certainly appears that way. So let's tune in, check out episode 2, and see if our intuitions are correct as well.
We go into work. We've already got people lined up to come in and interview. I personally had a friend of Mike's from the band era coming in to see me. And I'm not long into that interview before a detective interrupts the interview and gets me out of the interview room and tells me that they found a body out at Lakeside Golf Course.
Now, they found it. Where did they find it?
It was in what I call a spillway. It's kind of an overflow pond. This golf course sides up to one of Lexington's large reservoirs, and that's why it's called Lakeside.
How close was that to the apartment that he lived at?
It was a good ways. I mean, a couple of miles, maybe 3.
So how did someone stumble upon him in that pond?
It was the workers when they came in that morning, bright and early, and they could see something that was out of place floating, and they realized pretty quickly that it was a body.
So this was the next day, after all. So this quickly transpired. So do you go out to that? Do you end your interview with this person and you just say, we've got to continue later?
Yeah, I had to tell her that we'd get back to her to go on and just be somewhere where we can find you. We, the entire squad responded out to the golf course as well as the identification people, the crime scene investigation.
Now, this was February the 4th.
Yes.
And it was in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
And what was the temperature? What was the weather condition?
It's February, so it's in the 40s. It's really mild. I would call it wet. I think it had been raining a little bit or misting at least.
So you went out there, and what did you discover?
Well, they had just recovered Mike's body. They had called the fire department, and they came out with a boat and basically just pulled him to the shore there. Mike was described Well, we were told that his green bathrobe was missing from the house. And we could tell this person's in a green bathrobe. We see a wedding ring on his hands, and rigor mortis is set in the body, and liver mortis as well.
Just real quickly, too, for the audience, rigor mortis, liver mortis, just in simple terms, what are those things and how are they different?
Rigor mortis is where the joints of the body will seize up for a certain time period after the body is dead. And it varies greatly on when exactly that is. The temperature in water is different and everything else. Now, liver mortis is where the blood pools in the body. And you can tell if the body was in one place for a while, you're going to have this purple blue tint on the sides of the body that were lowest to the ground, and be able to see evidence of that.
So the body was discovered, and at what point do you notify the family?
Well, that was a real dilemma because we have to keep the scene, and I've got to at least get a good idea of what the scene has to tell me. But the news trucks are everywhere, and I'm going, oh, Lord, they're going to find out on the news. So this was before cell phones, so we didn't have any way to call them from the scene. And so I raced on to Don's house, and Maggie was already there, too. And they had seen it on the news, so they were pretty shaken. And of course, I had to confirm for them that it was, in fact, Mike's body.
You know, from a victim's perspective, I've learned, and over the years, and you and David have learned over the years, that death notification is a big deal to crime victims. And one of the things Don continues to regret is that he learned of his son's death on the news. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that you raised the issue of no cell phones at that time. Isn't it amazing what cell phones have done for things like that?
Well, sure.
Well, so I have to backtrack a little. When you got there and they had pulled him to the shore, was there any evidence of that blood you found in his hallway, or was there any trauma or injury on him?
Oh, yes, quite a bit. We counted up to 19 stab wounds up high on his chest and into his neck.
Wow. So you all get him out, and I guess what happens at that point is he transported to?
Well, you're calling the coroner to come out to the scene. You don't do anything with the body until he arrives.
What's the coroner?
The coroner is the chief law enforcement officer of the county, so he's got authority over everyone, including the sheriff and police chief.
At a death scene?
And at a death scene, he is the authority, yes. And so you do everything in concert with the coroner's office.
And what did he do in this case?
Well, he obviously made the death declaration and had Mike's body transported over to the University of Kentucky Medical Center, where at that time we were doing autopsies. Dr. John Hunsaker was the associate chief medical examiner at that time, and he mainly operated out of the University of Kentucky, where the other associate chief operated out of Louisville.
Now tell me what the purpose of the coroner is. Excuse me, the medical examiner.
Oh, the medical examiner now is a real doctor, which the coroner could be and has been off and on in different places, but they certainly don't have to be. And in this case, Coroner Hager was a mortician, a funeral director, very well known around the county at that time.
Then how do they get to be a coroner? What's the process? How do they?
Oh, it's an election. Yes, it's purely a running for public office, and there's no built-in qualifications for it. You just run against whoever else, and if you get enough votes, you're the coroner.
So what did Hunsaker come up with?
Well, he came up with confirming once again that Mike did have multiple stab wounds. He gave us a time of death, probably somewhere over the 24 hours. And that again, once you start getting down to that long, and especially floating in water, it's a guess, but an educated one.
What was the cause of death?
Exsanguination. In other words, he bled to death.
From the 19 stab wounds?
19 stab wounds, some of which did. The biggest thing that Dr. John identified to us is that almost all of the stab wounds were very shallow, which was remarkable. They were only an inch, 2 inches deep, but of course that many wounds, and they had hit enough blood vessels to cause them to lose blood over time and die.
That information, I guess, was delivered to the family.
Yes.
And so what happens next in your investigation? Because it's gone now from missing persons to a homicide investigation.
Well, it really doesn't change much because, like I say, we were already dealing with it as a homicide, so there wasn't any switching gears or anything. We continued to interview people. We did a neighborhood investigation around a golf course on the chance that maybe someone saw a car pulling in or something to that effect, and really just more or less developing background. We're learning little bits here and there. We learn about a binge that Elizabeth went on with two of the other car salesmen. I think she had sold her first car, and of course that's a good excuse to party. And so she went on an all-nighter with these two male car salesmen and apparently had sex with both of them. So we interviewed them and the people at the dealership and actually saw Karen and Keith there at work.
Let's identify what you've said that Elizabeth was a salesperson.
Yes.
And Karen worked there too?
Yes, Karen.
And what did Karen do?
She was a detailer.
And Keith?
He also did some detailing on cleaning the new cars up, but he was also kind of a handyman. Keith had just come out of the Army, young guy, petite, but in good shape.
So at this point, you now have identified Michael. Who reaches out to the grieving widow?
Well,
and was she grieving?
She was actually still at the parents' house, and I got the feeling that they didn't want her there, and found out later on that was definitely what they didn't want was her hanging around. Maggie just right off the bat. And Don too, I think, but Maggie is a very determined woman, and she saw nothing good coming out of Elizabeth. Don would tell us later on how much Mike had changed since Elizabeth had come into his life. Like I say, Mike Turpin was pictured as this perfect guy next door, collegiate, clean cut, very well spoken, very mild, meek, and all this, and he would show up at every family dinner, not just special occasions. All of a sudden, that stuff started stopping. Lame excuses were given, and I think a couple of times Mike actually did break down when talking with his dad about why he wasn't coming to dinner, and Don could tell that he wasn't happy.
During that period of time, Maggie, Michael's mom, did she just really have deep-seated fears of Michael ultimately marrying Elizabeth?
Yes, she did.
But he did. And so, as Wendy would say, where do we go from here?
Mm-hmm. Well, we do go from there. We had just finished another 12-hour day on Thursday. So now we're the fourth day into the investigation. I think I got home right at midnight. Then I got called back out at about 1:30 that morning. Two witnesses that we had already interviewed had walked into the detective bureau and had told the night shift detectives that they had some things to share with us. And so by the time we got there, they informed us, and this woman and young man were basically roommates of Karen's, and Keith was crashing there at the time. So both of them were at this apartment, Old Farm Apartments. And they were telling us about three things, that the major things was looking out their window and Karen and Keith out at Karen's car, which was an old Chevette with ammonia and several other cleaners scrubbing at the interior of the car. Then they told us about a call from Keith to Doug, which is one of these witnesses that walked in one afternoon, and it was the afternoon that Mike's body was found, that he called him, and he was very excited and animated on the phone and says, "Keith, you got to get my shoes. You got to get my shoes and throw them out. Go to get rid of them." Karen had picked up on this excited conversation over the phone, and she came up and grabbed the phone away from Doug and told Keith, "You need to calm down. Just, you don't be doing that." So that certainly
was suspicious.
Got our attention, yes.
Okay. Did you have an opportunity to look at that vehicle?
Yes, we did. You could see it just walking by that there was a problem. And another thing that Dee and Doug told us, they had ridden in that car, and afterwards that it had just a very strong, musky odor to it that wasn't there before. So that added also to our suspicions. We spent Friday trying to confirm as much as we could, figuring out where the residences were for everybody involved, and writing search warrants, affidavits for search warrants. When you try to plan these things ahead, and it did take us a long time on Friday. Otherwise, we'd have gone Friday evening for that matter. But it was so late by the time we got everything lined up and had our plan on what to do, then we just decided to come in bright and early, crack of dawn kind of thing on Saturday. And we had 3 search warrants, one for the car, one for the old farm apartment, and one to go back to Mike and Elizabeth's apartment. It had been in our custody the whole time, but we were okay searching it without a warrant leading up to this. But then once we developed probable cause, then we felt like we needed to. It's always better to do the warrant. You know, we might have been okay without it, but we immediately took Keith and Karen into custody. Elizabeth was out of town. We knew that she was. Her lawyer had called us and told us that she was going to Louisville to visit with her family over the weekend, and gave us an address and phone number and everything about where she would be. So we get Karen and Keith down to headquarters, into separate interrogation rooms, and start seeing what they had to say. Keith lawyered up pretty quickly. And so when he did, we had no choice but to discontinue the interview with him. We continued on with Karen. Karen gave us a statement. She talked about Elizabeth talking her and Keith into doing it, told us about going by and trying to get the gun, told us about her and Keith while Karen was staying at her apartment, while Elizabeth was staying at Karen's apartment, and going up to Mike's door, ringing the doorbell. Mike's in his bathrobe, comes to the door, and Keith immediately sets upon him. And Keith had taken paring knives, we later found out, and he got fingerless weightlifting gloves, and he would insert the paring knives out through the finger slots. And so there was only an inch or two of knife blade there, and he would make like a fist, and he was attacking Mike like this. Well, he pretty quickly took Mike to the ground with the assistance of Karen, and Karen helped hold Mike to the ground. They rolled his body up in a blanket and carried it down the steps, put it into Karen's car, and went to Lakeside Golf Course where they dumped it in a spillway. We placed both Keith and Karen under arrest for murder, and we were getting ready to transport both of them to the jail. Keith blurts out we had him sitting at a desk, and he blurts out and said, "Well, I suppose you want to go by my grandmother's and get those knives." Mike Malone, the first Commonwealth attorney to first assistant Commonwealth attorney, I had to tell him literally to shut up, that he had invoked his right to a lawyer and could not make statements until we got him one. So still, that was what I would call a pretty good spontaneous utterance.
I'd say so.
Yeah.
So who contacts Elizabeth, or does anybody contact Elizabeth at this point and says, your friends have been talking?
Oh, yeah, we do. We had taken out a arrest warrant for Elizabeth Turpin for the charge of murder, called Jefferson County Homicide Squad, asking them to go by, and I think it was her brother's place that they were at, and execute the warrant. So Jefferson County picked her up from the brother's house, and we had Maria Neal dispatched to Louisville to pick her up and bring her back to the Fayette County Detention Center. This cultivated a 90-hour work week for the robbery homicide squad. We had 40-plus officers involved, including the 6 detectives and 4 crime scene technicians. They were 14, 16, 13, 12, one 21-hour day, and then the last one 13 hours, ending with me meeting with the parents and informing them of the arrest. We did 120 witness interviews during that week, 7 crime lab submissions, with 3 crime lab scientists assigned to it. 4 search warrants were executed on 6 different crime scenes. I like to talk about some of the homicides that you go out on, and you just call it a sprint. You show up at 9:00 that night and you're done by 9:00 the next morning. That's considered about as quick as any homicide will go. And that was very clear, no whodunit to it, and plenty of evidence there. But some of them go on for months. But I like to call this one an Ironman marathon, just from you get so tired when you stop to think about it, but normally you don't stop very often.
Yeah, I was going to ask if sleep was just optional at this point.
It was just optional. And, we finished that 121-hour day that I think maybe I got about 3 hours of sleep on. But then you get to this, at least a preliminary climax of knowing that you've developed your reasonable suspicion and your probable cause, and you've got 3 defendants in custody. And by the time we got done, it was about 10 o'clock at night. I believe we raced each other down to Columbia Steakhouse downtown and got a big old steak and probably a couple of beverages.
Adult beverages, no doubt.
No doubt.
Good way to celebrate. Let me ask you this, because there's a popular TV show called First 48, and you're talking about the sprints and the marathons and everything. Do you put a lot into that on that 48-hour concept or theory?
Oh, I think so. I think so, and that's one of the reasons I was so scared on this case, is because we gone well past 48 hours without really being able to sink our teeth into something. We were up to the 4th day of the investigation before we finally had everything clicked together.
Gotcha. And you get to that point where you're celebrating having a victory or a good outcome and everything. How's that compare to, for example, the surviving victim's family? What's their perspective? Are they in the same realm with you on that, or
no? You would like to think that they would have some kind of relief or even some kind of closure or happiness or whatever that you've put the bad guys into jail. But it didn't bring their son back. And I think, too, they know what's coming, that, it's going to be months and maybe years to get to trial and then a lengthy trial, and they might not get convicted. So I'm afraid it just never ends for the victims.
Well, they have to keep reliving it over and over.
Yeah. Well, and then there's parole hearings.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so there's no happy endings for them.
To get to that point, Ray, where we're talking about now, where does it go from here once they make that arrest and start that process?
Well, these 3 defendants were arrested. All 3 of them were charged with the intentional murder of Michael Turpin. And the murder, they were charged with a murder for profit. Because if you'll remember, Fran talked about this insurance policy. And in Kentucky, the death penalty is available in only 8 different circumstances. The most egregious of murders, whether it's multiple murder, like Timothy McVeigh killed 167, a murder in the course of a rape or a robbery in the first degree or a burglary in the first degree, just those kind of cases that are just awful, and one of which is a murder for profit. And it was alleged by the grand jury that these people, 3 people, murdered Mike Turpin for his insurance money. And so as a result, the grand jury indicted these people, and it was a death penalty case, which elevates all of the stakes involved in the preparation for trial and all of the rest of it. So at this point, of course, I've been involved with Fran and the police throughout this investigation. I was kind of kept in the loop because unless the prosecutor is kept in the loop, then there's not a good relationship between police and prosecutors, and it makes it harder. So they presented to the grand jury, they were indicted, and then we start looking at the case. Now let me tell you a problem with this case that we noticed right away. You got 3 defendants, and all 3 of those defendants know what happened. And all of them have, as Fran says, lawyered up. They're represented by lawyers. And we can't force them to testify against themselves. So what kind of evidence do we have other than their own testimony that would convict them? None. I mean, we got suspicion all over the place, just like Fran had the first day he ran into Elizabeth, but we didn't have any proof that anybody did anything because they all have lawyers and don't have to testify. So we had to figure out how are we going to manage this. And so we consult with Fran and the other detectives and the other lawyers involved in the case, and we say somebody's got to testify about this. And this is where you get into this thing that everybody hates, plea bargaining. And so we had 3 people there. I think we all felt, at least I didn't for sure, but I think all of us felt that none of this would have happened but for Elizabeth Turpin. And so she was our main target. And we all thought, why don't we try to talk to Karen Brown? And so she was represented, and we talked to her attorney and said, we'd like to talk to Karen Brown, your client, because we had a court ruling that didn't allow us to use Karen's statement that Fran had told us about. It was suppressed, so that was out. So we wanted to talk to Karen's lawyer, and we did, and he told us she would be happy to talk to you if you would recommend that she serve 3 years. I told him basically to kiss my ass. That wasn't going to happen. That I would rather that Elizabeth Turpin walked out of there rather than give one of them 3 years. So that Karen Brown was off the table. The other option was Keith. And at this point, we didn't know who did what at the scene. We didn't know who did the stabbing. We didn't know who did the holding down. So I can remember talking to Fran about this, and I said, we got to try to talk to Keith Bouchard, and we don't know what his role is. So we did, and we decided, how can we do this? We haven't even talked to his brother, his twin brother, Kenneth. I said, let's try to get a hold of Kenneth and get him to give us a statement. And I'm not sure how it happened, but Keith learned about that and must have communicated with Kenneth, because we got a call from Keith's attorney, Jennifer, and said, Keith would like to talk to you. Well, so my fear as the prosecutor in this case, I don't want to plea bargain with the person that did the stabbing. I just did not want to do that, because it just looked, you got to think in terms, how's the jury going to take this, you see? Because I'm getting ready to take a case to trial. And so...
Well, let me ask you this. Along with them, how about the family? How do families respond to that if you come to them with a plea bargain?
Well, we talked to Don and Maggie throughout this thing. It was nothing new. There was nothing new. We told them what we wanted to do, and they also believed that Elizabeth was the main character in this thing, and they wanted us to do whatever we had to do to convict the main character. So this is something we did, and it was when whoever interviewed Keith found out that Keith did the stabbing and that Karen held Mike down while he was stabbing. So I thought, oh, hell, the jury's going to hate me for this. But we didn't have any evidence. And so we recommended a life sentence for Keith, and he pled guilty. And then he testified. And he was a reluctant witness on the stand, but he made it through. So this case went to trial, and these were days when trials went to trial quickly. This thing went to trial within 6 months of the time it occurred. These days, it can be years before a murder case goes to trial. But it went to trial, and one of the few times, I got a rule that I will not, on juries, I don't allow lawyers to be on juries because they turn into critics, and I don't want retired school teachers because they think, oh, if they just learned to read earlier, everything would be okay. I left a lawyer on it because we knew that they were very difficult instructions. Those are when the judge reads the law to the jurors before they go out to deliberate. There was very complicated instructions, and I wanted a lawyer on there to be able to go through the process, the thought process with them. And so we had a lawyer on there, and the jury was out. I guess they went out at night, and they came back and went out again, and they came back and found both of them guilty of intentional murder for profit. And that means the death penalty is on the table because you go through two processes in a criminal trial. One is the guilt phase, where the jury has to determine whether or not a person is guilty as charged. And if they do, then you come back and go through the penalty phase. So we did that, and I can't remember how long they were out, Fran.
I think it was longer than on the guilt phase.
Mm-hmm. Because the death penalty was on the table. I have had an opportunity to talk to some of the jurors in the years since then. It's only been 30-some. And they'll come up to me on the street and talk to me about it. And the question I had for the jurors was, tell me, did the fact that we let Keith Bouchard plead guilty play any role in your decision? He says, nope. We knew you had to do it, which was refreshing because, that means they were thinking. It was a pretty close vote on the death penalty for Elizabeth Turpin, but they ultimately sentenced she and Karen Brown both to life in the penitentiary, and they have to serve at least 25 years before they're eligible for parole. Now, one of the heartbreaking things about a case like this is the damn parole system, because the Turpin family goes to every parole hearing, and so do I. They will be coming up on the 5th parole hearing that they have to attend. You know, Keith, I think, is sentenced to a serve-out. Means he's in for the rest of his life. The person that'll help him out of prison is going to be the undertaker. Now, we've got the parole hearing for Karen Brown and Elizabeth Turpin coming up. And I'll be there. And I bet Fran will be there.
When is that coming up, Ray?
In October of 2021.
Right around the corner.
Mm-hmm. Assuming I'm still alive.
Let's hope so.
So this was one of the highest profile cases and trials in the history of Fayette County. The courtroom was packed with old folks and all sorts of conglomeration of types of people. And they would stand in line to get in. It was wild, and it was a decent result on it. Now, how about the family? Listen, the family never gets over it. And I'll tell you something interesting about people and death. In America, Americans give folks 30 days to get over the death of a family member or anybody else. 30 days. After which, they don't want to hear about it anymore. Now, in the family of Don Turpin and every other person that's lost somebody wants to talk about it all the time. And so when any of the people that are listening to this podcast have an opportunity to talk to somebody who has lost someone to violence or anything else, ask them how they're doing. And they'll do what people always do. Oh, I'm fine. But then ask them, how are you doing, really? And I'll tell you, they'll cloud up. Some of them start crying. And if you ask them those things, number one, they'll appreciate it. But number two, be prepared to listen, because they want to talk.
And don't ever tell them that you know how they feel.
Absolutely.
Okay, so you're getting ready. You're a star witness in this homicide. Tell me what kind of preparation you do, and are you nervous about it? And how do you prepare for cross-examination? Tell me about how you do that.
The avenue I like to take is putting together what I call my testimony jacket, where I assemble every piece of paper, every note that I think I might need to remember and talk about during my testimony, both to the prosecutor and plus what may be exculpatory that the defense attorney is going to try to lead me down to. So for the weeks, sometimes even a month before the trial, I'm putting together these copies, and they're copies separate from the case jacket. You know, just get out what I need, and then I can mark them up in any way I want to. I highlight and write notes off to the side. I say, well, that question didn't get answered on that particular memo. Let me go follow up on it. Maybe we need to talk to somebody else more. And I found that 95% of the major cases I ever went to trial on, I never had to open that testimony book. Never had to break it open. Just knowing it was there is kind of like Linus and his blanket. But I think more importantly, it was putting a thing together that.
What about getting ready for cross-examination? Those snarling defense lawyers that want you to trip over your tongue.
I treat them just like I would the prosecutor.
Oh, that bad?
Yeah. Well, almost. In court as well as the prosecutor. I always consider myself an independent giver of fact. I'm not on anybody's side, even though I am. I certainly want to see justice come out of it, but I think the more you can come across to a jury that you are independent, you're not going to say anything that it isn't true, and you're not even going to lean it one way or another. No spin, in other words. So, and the other part of that is if you've got a good prosecutor, in this case, we've got a great prosecutor that spends all the time that's necessary with you to prepare you for going on the stand. Worked with many prosecutors that don't even think the police are important in a criminal case. Caught them at times not even reading the case jacket and then just shooting from getting bad results. Well, you won't see that out of Ray the DA. You're going to be fully prepared, and that just helps your confidence. I mean, I've seen new people take the stand, and they get the dry mouth and the deer in a headlight look and all that. But I think even new people that are prepared properly can do a pretty good job.
David, you've always said something about detectives or people that testify need to testify in order to learn how to testify. What do you mean?
Absolutely. If you don't practice that, it's like any perishable skill. If you don't experience it, I think you're in bad shape when you get to trial. And one of the things that I see now, and I noticed it before I retired, is because of the way the system works through agreements and plea bargains, is that a lot of police really don't get good trial testimony experience anymore. And like anything else, sometimes you got to learn the hard way. Sometimes you have to get on that stand and take an aggressive cross-examination to understand what that feels like. And maybe,
get your head handed to you.
Yeah, exactly. And then to move into that realm, like then you learn how to prepare, like Fran was talking about. And probably for me, the biggest thing is when Fran was talking about being right in the middle of everything and the objectivity that you display and the fact-finding and giving, to me, that was the trick for me too, because the jury then looks at you and you become harder to shake on cross-examination. As a matter of fact, a lot of attorneys I met would go too far, and the jury would look over and they would almost, I think they were looking at it like, well, that's bullying, because they're just trying to do the right thing. But I know for me, whenever I walked in and went with the case, is that for sure we were prepared. There was no doubt about that. But the practice of it is what made it real. And again, and that's what's rough on a lot of people. Sometimes, for example, if you're a patrol officer and you take this first missing person report, you're going to start that trial. And I used to teach that in report writing. You're going to take the stand. You'll be one of the first people up there. And if they haven't had any trial experience, just simply talking about going out there that day and meeting people and taking those facts and putting them on paper will intimidate a new officer because they're terrified. But practice is like anything else. It's a perishable skill. You have to have things thrown at you to know how to catch them or to swing back if it comes to that. But that's a problem I think police face everywhere because the expediency of the system is we don't get on the stand as much as we should.
I was a prosecutor in this town for 32 years, and I had the great benefit of working with really professional police. I didn't have any cowboys to deal with, and you have no idea what a benefit that is to a prosecutor. So, Fran, thanks. And David, thank you.
No, thank you. That was a blast.
It's my honor. Enjoyed it.
Yeah. I've always said, and Fran, you can say this too, that because you left with a higher rank than I did, is I have a significant collection of badges, but I've always said there's only one in that display case that really holds a lot of meaning. That's one that says detective, and that's because of the time I spent with Ray in his office. No doubt about that.
Yeah, no doubt.
Well, we're just sucking up to each other.
Ray
here.
Sounds like you're the superstar here today.
Well, I always liked Fran and David.
Well, and I quit recording 2 minutes ago. The Murder Police podcast is hosted by Wendy and David Lyons and was created to honor the lives of crime victims so their names are never forgotten. This podcast is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lyons. The Murder Police podcast can be found on your favorite Apple or Android podcast platform, as well as at murderpolicepodcast.com, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe for more and give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or wherever you download your podcast from. And please tell your friends. Lock it down, Judy.